You're listening to an episode of What on Earth is Going On? This show was originally broadcast on the radio at CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. It is now available to you in this format with all spoken content unabridged. For more information, visit wogoshow.com. That's WOEGO show.com. I hope you enjoy the podcast. Hello, and welcome to What on Earth is Going On? Our world seems to be in flux, and things are changing so fast that it's hard to get a grip. We take you underneath the headlines and get to the bottom of the events, characters, forces, and ideas that shape the human story today. My name is Ben, and each week I talk with somebody who thinks, and thinks deeply, about what on earth is going on. Climate change, artificial intelligence, free trade, you name it. Why are things happening? How did they come to be? And where are we all headed? If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, please reach out. The show is online at wogoshow.com. That's WOEGO show.com. There, you can download all previous episodes, including this one, as well as link to the show on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. It's there and everywhere that I hope you'll contribute to the ongoing discussion. In a little bit, we're going to hear my interview with Dr. Warren Mabee, an expert in renewable resources at Queen's University. We're going to talk about the pressing need in the face of a changing climate to rethink how we produce, consume, and transmit energy, to diversify our energy sources, and to reorder our daily lives as well as the larger structures of our economies. These changes, whether in the form of self-driving cars or backyard geothermal plants, are coming regardless of climate change. They're happening naturally, according to economic incentives, as we innovate and make goods like solar panels even cheaper. But such changes are not just about convenience and leisure. They may transform the way we conceive of our ecology, our society, and our place within it. All of that is coming up. Now, there are some big forces at play in the world. Certainly, one of the biggest is our changing environment, which might be better described as our changing habitat. Not just global warming, but environmental degradation, overstretched and underprotected natural resources, the shifting geopolitics, and frankly, geography of energy extraction. We may discover in the hindsight of, say, a century, that all of our seemingly isolated smaller problems, whether we're talking terrorism, suicide rates, economic or ethnic nationalism, distrust in politicians and the media, even our distorted sense of self, all of these may in fact be connected to our radically shifting habitat. When we look back at ancient civilizations in today's Mexico, Peru, Iraq, China, and India, we can see clearly the root causes that led to civilizational collapse. Jared Diamond's work in Guns, Germs, and Steel, as well as his book Collapse, makes it clear that when past societies imploded, there was almost always environmental factors right at the center. Cut down too many trees, strain the rivers and lakes, overcultivate the soil. Our environment cannot put up with us forever, and eventually we outrun ourselves. But for the first time in our history, we have the ability to look back and assess, without superstition, the shipwrecks of our past, modify our behavior accordingly. But in our politics, we don't seem to be able to act long-term and tackle these existential threats directly, boldly, and definitively. In typical democracies, elections occur every few years, which forces politicians to act in the short-term interest even when they and we can see the long. Voters likewise favor concrete, tangible action. Cut taxes, increase services, reduce crime, build hospitals. Who wants to vote for a plan that will lead to all of these things but 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the line? Shouldn't it be simpler than that? More troublingly, people have lost trust and faith in the system. Maybe it's because most people never had to fight for it in war or through a depression. Maybe it's a lack of civics classes. Perhaps also, liberal democracies have become overly managerial and technocratic. In other words, all of the big structural and moral decisions have already been made. So by the time you sit in the ballot box, your options feel rather dull. It is apple versus apple versus apple, with various shadings of red, distinctions without difference. Politicians find themselves trying to make a feast out of a morsel, fighting over marginal tax rates and pension alterations and healthcare budgets. These issues are absolutely important, as anyone who works in government or policy or that particular special interest will tell you. But for someone who doesn't want to spend their time knee-deep in policy muck, it's just plain boring. I mean, is it any wonder that when an orange is thrown in with all of the apples, people get excited? Even if they know that the orange is off color and rancid and full of mold, maybe they'd rather pick the orange rather than see another apple ever again. I get it. This is a poor summation of what is happening with our democracy. Many thinkers call it the crisis of liberalism. They have written all kinds of articles and books in earnest since Brexit and Trump demonstrated in 2016 that liberal democracy is not an inevitable endpoint of history or in some terminal abstract decline, but rather that it is ripe for a fall. It's ironic because those who now rush to defend the rules-based order of individual rights and free market capitalism with a pinch of government, untampered elections, healthy press, and the belief in human progress, they often call themselves liberals or progressives. But by definition, they're conservative. They want to conserve what we already have. Whatever label we use, not all defenders want to just go back to the way things were before an amoral PR mogul became the U.S. president. Many propose some radical changes to the way we govern our societies, not only in response to the threat of a tyrant or a demagogue or just an ignoramus taking over, but in response to the long-term civilizational issues like climate change that we all know we're going to have to face. Some of these ideas seem evil. For example, put multinational corporations in charge to maximize their profit. Some of them are old-fashioned. Abolish the concept of property, for example. Some are capricious, like take away the vote from those who can't prove they know what they're talking about, or give those who can more votes. Some of the ideas are proven recipes for disaster, like letting the army run things. And some are so crazy that they might just work. Say, abolish parliaments and turn a constitution into an algorithm. But not all ideas are nuts or immoral or pie in the sky, though all of them sound radical at first. Here are a few from a recent book called Radical Markets: Uprooting Capitalism and Democracy for a Just Society by Eric Posner and E. Glenn Weil. At core, Posner and Weil want the very idea of markets to go beyond just making money and to serve society as a whole. They propose a wealth tax in which everyone must place a value on every single thing they own. Your car, your blender, your dog's ashes, everything. You will be taxed on your overall wealth, whether it is high or low, whatever it is that you declare. The catch is that you have to be ready to sell anything that you have at the value you gave it. So if you want to lower your taxes by saying that your Porsche is worth only $500, then you must be prepared to sell your Porsche to the first person willing to pay $500. The idea here is that all property is put to best use while raising revenue more efficiently. And that's not all. Another idea in the book is to rethink how we vote. So you get rid of the one person, one vote, and instead everyone gets an equal amount of credits, which in turn can buy votes on particular issues or for particular people. So say that you get 100 credits. If you feel really passionate about, say, stopping people from spreading dog ashes in parks, then you can spend all of your credits on that, or you can spread it around. The more you spend on one thing, however, the more it costs you to spend more on that same thing. In other words, your first vote would cost, say, 1 credit, but your second on that same thing would be 4, and your third would be 9. This, in theory, would allow minorities to fight back against majorities that are impinging on their rights. People who care more about one issue will vote more on that one issue. In practice, you actually get more votes for caring about more things. Now, these ideas are outlandish, and they would lead to many unintended consequences. But the authors are not proposing them because they think that they are the only way or even the right way. They want to jumpstart the conversation, to give a little life to it, about how we govern ourselves and our structures of our societies. They want to bring back the big questions. Because if we agree that this is not working, then it might be better if we think through our next steps rather than just let things happen. It's better if we think long term, no? Better to come up with ideas about our predicament than just shrug about it, shrug about the unfairness, and go about our next distraction. Because who knows what will join the basket of apples and oranges in the ballot box next time around if we simply leave our political evolution to its own devices. Dr. Warren Mabee is, in his own words, a forester who somehow became a geographer. He is a professor and head of the Department of Geography and Planning, as well as a professor of policy studies at Queen's University in Kingston. He is a Canada Research Chair in Renewable Energy Development and Implementation, as well as the director of Queen's Institute for Energy and Environmental Policy. His research focuses on the interface between renewable energy policy and technologies, with particular emphasis on wood energy and biofuels. Professor Mabee, thanks for having this conversation with me.
Thanks for having me.
So these are turbulent times politically, economically, and culturally, but perhaps one of the greatest crises that we face as a civilization is far more basic and universal, and it is imminent. I'm talking, of course, about climate change. The need for us to adapt, to make critical, innovative, and maybe even paradigm-shifting choices about how we produce, transmit, and consume energy is unavoidable. But these may be opportunities for growth and prosperity as well. In other words, it's not all doom and gloom. So, Professor Mabee, when it comes to renewable energy and the technologies we will need to access it, what on earth is going on?
Well, it's a great question, and I think that it's incredibly timely. We're really at a tipping point when it comes to renewable energy technologies and the options that are available to us to power our society. 10 years ago, if you'd asked the same question, the answer would have been, there's a lot of ideas out there, a lot of things on the shelf that we're pulling down and trying out, but we don't really have a prescription yet. We don't have a solution in hand. Today, I think we do. Today, I think that the suite of technologies that's out there, and I'm talking about solar panels, wind turbines, I'm talking about tidal power, I'm talking about biomass and bioenergy. I'm talking about geothermal power. There's a whole suite of solutions that are now getting to the point that they're commercially feasible, so that they actually make sense, that can deliver us power on a renewable, sustainable basis, that are going to be able to move our society forward, and which are going to really compete effectively with the fossil-based alternatives that we're really trying to step away from. It's an exciting time.
And it sounds like the paradigm may have already shifted. Most investors, most people know that we're moving away from oil and gas, whether we like it or not. Not just because we know that we need to do it for our climate, but we also know that, say, solar panels are becoming so cheap. It's now, in many countries, cheaper to produce energy through solar than it is to, say, through coal or oil or gas or any other resource. Yeah. So what does that paradigm shift mean? I mean, are we there yet, or do we still have work to do in public consciousness?
Well, I think that there's work to do on the public side. I think that there's some technical work to do to really take advantage of this entire opportunity that's in front of us, and we can get into that. But certainly, when you look at the cost per kilowatt hour, when you look at how much it costs to deliver electrons to somebody's house, if it's a sunny day, solar panels are going to win over, a coal source or even a natural gas source. If it's a windy day, wind power is going to win. We're at a point where those alternatives look really appealing. The big technical hurdle that's still on the table is storage. You know, the sun doesn't shine all the time. The wind doesn't blow all the time. And we need ways to store up this power and to use it more effectively over the entire course of a day or the entire course of a year. We're getting there. There's still quite a few, things to work out along that road. But I think that people are really starting to embrace the technologies, far more than they did 10 years ago or 15 years ago. It's becoming mainstream.
So that's a good point, because when I read about the renewable energy transition, I mean, we're still only a few % of the world's energy output coming from renewables, but it's growing almost at an exponential rate now.
Yep.
But the key there, as you said, is storage. Are we talking about batteries, or are there other ways to store energy?
So there's a bunch of different ways, actually, that you can store energy that you need. There is thermal storage, so the idea of storing heat, and it can be done in a mass. So you can do it, masonry masses store heat really well. That's why they used to build chimneys, that were so big and massive in those very old houses and old buildings, because they would store up heat. And then at night, when you were asleep, and you weren't stoking the fire, you'd still get some heat off that masonry mass. And so there are modern ways to apply that idea. You can store heat underground, and that geo-storage idea has really kind of taken off. It's expensive, but we're working our way through that problem and figuring out how to do it better. We can store potential energy behind dams. So hydropower is actually a great way to store energy over, long periods, not just hours, but days, weeks, months. And that storage system works really well where you have the right geography. So in a place like Quebec, where there are lots of reservoirs, lots of valleys, lots of places that they can back the water up, you can store lots of potential power for when you need it. Batteries will be part of the solution for sure. They won't be seasonal storage, like you won't put power into a battery and then pull it out 6 months later. And for some places in our country, when you talk about Canada's north, the Arctic, batteries are not going to be the solution. We need something else, but it will be part of the solution.
So we're talking about both micro and macro. In other words, if I'm going to fast forward 20 years, how will my life be different? Well, it might be different in the way that I turn on my furnace at night. It might be different in the way that I receive energy in my home, but it's also different in terms of how the energy is produced and stored. So say these big, huge plants of batteries that, say, Elon Musk is building in California or Australia, but we're also talking about maybe a battery that's built into my garage too.
Yeah, and I think that one of the trends that we're seeing in the energy sector is kind of granulation. So we're moving from big central utility grids, the power grids, or big centralized oil production or gas production that is distributed out through pipes to lots of different customers, to something that's much more local, so that you're getting power generated much closer to your house, which ultimately means that you pay a lot less for infrastructure to move that power around. Ultimately, it means that you have a more secure grid because there's a lot of granularity, a lot of potential for islands, basically small areas that can power themselves. You've got the idea that almost every building can become an energy generator, maybe not a net energy generator, but some contributor to the overarching energy needs. And I think we're gonna reimagine the way that we generate power, use it, share it. I really don't think we're going to be infrastructure heavy in the future. I think we're going to realize at some point that there are cheaper and better and more secure ways of generating power close to where we need it.
Well, and you've said before that, for example, Canada's oil and gas industry, centered in Alberta in particular, actually still has a future, because the way in which we consume this energy will change in 20 years, but we will still need oil and gas, say for plastics and things like that. We may not be putting it into our cars. We may not be burning coal or burning oil in order to power our homes, but we will still need it for other uses.
Yeah, I think that the resources that we have are going to be repurposed. So, right now, oil is kind of facing a double whammy in that we recognize the climate implications of burning it, and we're trying to step away from that, and we're discovering along the way that it actually makes a lot of sense to look at other forms of powering things, particularly cars. But we're also realizing that the plastics industry has a lot of problems, right? And so I think that we will still use oil, and we'll use it in really smart ways. But I do think that there's a whole lot of work to be done to safeguard how it's used, because, the double-edged sword of oil, particularly as you turn it to plastics, is that it's persistent. A plastic product doesn't break down very easily, which is good and bad. In some cases, we don't want it to break down. We want it to stay in shape. We don't want it to deform after a year and fall apart. But on the other hand, we use plastic in a lot of ways where, really that durability works against it. And we need to find other things to do.
Just a funny tangent on plastics. I don't know if you know the comedian George Carlin, but he famously had a bit in one of his comedy shows where he said that the answer to the question of what is the meaning of life, plastic, because the Earth needed plastic, couldn't figure out how to get it on its own, created humans. Now we have the Earth plus plastic, and we can kind of go on our own way now that the Earth has plastic. But it's incredible to say and to see that plastic will remain, and other uses of oil will remain important in Canada. And that diversification, therefore, doesn't just mean changing what people do for their living or changing the whole economy of, say, Alberta, but actually diversifying within the oil and gas sector. And I think that's an important point.
Yeah, and you have to remember that with a population that is going up all the time, we're talking in Canada about potentially having a population between 80 million and 100 million people by the year 2100, which is not much compared to the rest of the planet, but still a lot compared to what we have right now. There's going to be a lot of demand for consumer products. There's going to be a lot of demand for energy. There's going to be a lot of demand for all of the accoutrements that go with society. And some of those are going to be met with those fossil resources for sure. It's just a question of finding the right uses for those resources, and that's where, my colleagues at the University of Alberta or places like that in the past had focused very much on the fossil energy side of things are now focused much more on, well, what could you do with this material if energy goes off the table?
Another challenge I think that renewable energy faces is particularly highlighted in Europe right now with Germany. Yeah. Germany has undergone an energy transition over the last couple of decades, moving quite far to using renewable energy. But one of the challenges that a lot of economists didn't predict was that if you have solar and wind energy so prevalent, that it makes energy so cheap to produce, cheap to produce that industry and anyone looking to make a dollar can't find a way to do it. Yeah. And so then you actually have this, the opposite effect, that no one wants to produce energy, and then we fall back on coal and oil and gas. How do we overcome that challenge?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because some of the new forms of renewables are becoming so cheap that it's going to be difficult to come up with a really good business strategy if we go with the old utility or, company-focused energy sector, which is the way that a lot of people are still thinking. So I like to think of it as more like a democratization of energy. It's a little bit like when computers moved from being mainframes to being on your desktop and now in your phone and, basically anywhere you need them to be. Anybody has access now to those types of technology. They're cheap enough and they're ubiquitous enough that we put them into everything. It's no longer controlled by big companies, and companies aren't making a lot of money just operating these computers. They found other ways to get around that. I think that the energy industry will eventually come to that kind of realization. Generation is not going to be the particularly difficult part. I could see a future where every building has solar panels built into the roofs and into the walls and the windows. And, we may have solar built into roads, and we could have wind built into tall buildings and so on and so forth. Generating the power is not going to be a problem. Managing the power, though, and coming up with really innovative ways of storing and then reusing that power and distributing it within these small kind of microgrids, that becomes an opportunity. And that's where I think that industry probably will still play a big role.
There are a lot of exciting technologies out there that are proposed, such as these solar panels on roads. So we have a huge amount of, I don't know what the statistics are, but there's obviously a huge amount of roads in Canada, throughout the Western world, throughout the world, that could easily, if this technology is correct, could be turned into solar panels. But I mean, how far away is this, or how much on the horizon is this, or is some of this stuff a little bit pie in the sky?
Well, some of it is certainly pie in the sky, and I think some of it will never happen just because although you can put a solar panel in every road, ultimately would you want to, particularly if you get into big urban centers where the shading and the coverage of those roads is pretty much, close to 100%. They're never really in the broad sunlight without cars on top of them. Buildings, I do think that eventually we're going to move towards basically all power generation all the time, because the building materials themselves will change, and the cladding that we put on buildings will have built-in solar, and the design of buildings will incorporate wind, and even the way that we do foundations and everything could encompass some geostorage of power and heat and things like that. I do think that as time goes on, we're going to see a shift in that direction. I think that there's always going to be that tension between, what can be done relatively cheaply versus, what is potentially possible. A lot of the technologies we're talking about now are potentially possible, but we never may want to actually implement them.
Well, and a lot of your research focuses on the interface between technology and renewable energy. How much of the revolution in renewable energy is actually not so much about technology in the sense we have to invent something, but it's stuff that we already have, say biomass or biofuels that are already in front of us and just need to be tapped into?
Well, a lot of it certainly is something that we can take advantage of, and opportunities that we've kind of left hanging for a long time. If you go back 50, 100 years, house design, for instance, used to be different. Nobody used to build a house with huge open windows, particularly north-facing windows, because that was an energy loss. They knew that they were going to lose heat out of the building. Right. And so very old houses have small windows, typically. They don't have big north-facing windows because they realized that was going to be a problem. They often had very thick walls, and that was the insulation side of things. We got away from that to some extent because building materials started to get more expensive. Building codes changed. We found different ways to insulate and, faster ways to build buildings. I do think we're going to move back towards designs that take advantage of those opportunities that are kind of right there in front of us. You talked about biomass and biofuels. One of the big things that I talk about in my research nowadays is the circular economy, the idea that there's a lot of residues and waste out there that probably should be turned into energy and not just landfilled. That you could utilize, say, a piece of wood as a table or as a wall or, as a piece of furniture for years and years and years and years. You might be able to recycle it 2 or 3 times, but at the very end of that lifespan, you should be able to pull the energy content back out. Right. And if you could do that, then you stop worrying about the waste end of it, and you really take advantage of the feedstock. You basically make it do 3 or 4 different jobs in its lifespan. And if you can do that, you've basically multiplied the amount of feedstock available by 3 or 4 times.
So this is a bit of a chicken and the egg question, but it seems like we are talking about both things that are going to change on the micro scale that are in my daily lives, the way I build my home, the way I drive my car, the way that I go about my daily life, but we're also talking about massive change that is probably going to happen through or by government. So are we talking, if we're going to make this transition to renewable energy quickly and efficiently and to take advantage of these opportunities, what should come first? Is it the awareness of people in their daily lives, or is it to change policy in government?
Well, I think that we've done a lot of the awareness building over the last 20 years. So some of the first climate policies in Canada were actually really just voluntary measures. I don't know if you remember Rick Mercer did his 1-ton challenge, right? The 1-ton challenge was all voluntary. It was all about, maybe turn down the heat at night or maybe unplug that second fridge. And I know David Suzuki did a whole series of commercials around that too. Those are voluntary, easy, low-hanging fruit. And it does help a little bit, but the biggest thing that it does is it raises people's awareness. At the same time, you do need government intervention, because the free market works really well once the market is established and moving forward. So once there is an industry out there that is going to make a product, that industry will make the product better and better and better and better. But in the first few years that you're trying to get things going, particularly when you're trying to change the paradigm, and really change the way that we do things, often you need government to get involved, to help fund some of the first pilot projects and demonstrations, to help fund the first factories, that make the products. We've seen that in Ontario around the Green Energy Act. There was investment in new renewable technologies and the manufacture of those technologies, as well as in the actual generators, the solar panels and things like that. So government has started to do some of that. We're now at a really interesting point, because a lot of the technologies actually are established. They're moving forward. What government needs to do now is they need to make it easy for people to use them. And they need to make it attractive for people to use them. And so carbon pricing starts to come into play,
right?
By charging people a little bit more for the conventional alternative, and to tell them, okay, but if you use this sustainable alternative, if you go to a green power, if you go to an electric car or something like that, we're actually going to find ways to incentivize that and make it a little bit easier for you to afford that. And the operating costs of driving an electric car, once you've bought the car, are very low,
right?
And people that buy them realize, wait a minute, I was spending a lot of money on gas. I don't spend nearly as much money on electricity to power this vehicle. It's actually a big win.
Right.
Yeah.
You spend a lot of your time researching and studying the benefits and the implications of certain renewable energy sources, studying and evaluating what they could mean socially, politically, economically, but also in terms of as an energy source.
Yep.
What's the energy source that is the most undervalued or underestimated by public awareness, would you say?
Well, that's a really good question, actually. There are some technologies that I think are really well understood, and solar and wind, there's some misconceptions out there, but people are pretty aware of them, and they know that they're out there. Bioenergy is, I think it's fairly well known, particularly biofuels. It's a complex issue, though, and the complexity shows up in a lot of the debate. There are many people who are concerned about things like biofuels, because they see it as taking food away from people or food away from animals, disrupting the agricultural system, potentially leading to deforestation, and turning grassland into cornfields and things like that. These are all real concerns, and I think that that's one of the areas where I don't want to say misconceptions, but public confusion has led to maybe less understanding about what the potential is of the technology. There are a few renewable technologies that we have not used much in Canada, geothermal being one. Iceland has gotten very deep into this, and places where there are active volcanoes.
Sure.
We don't have a lot of active volcanoes in Canada, so I don't think we're going to do a lot of geothermal power generation. I think we'll do a lot of geostorage, and that's something that's just starting to get into people's awareness.
So what is geostorage?
Geostorage is the idea of pumping heat underground in the summertime and then pulling it back out in the winter, using the ground, which is a fairly steady temperature, basically, as a way of storing the energy that you're going to need over the course of a season. And for some of our northern communities, it may have some potential, in order to power them. Now, the problem with that is that storing heat is very different than storing electricity, and the value, the quality of the heat that you're storing, it's not over 100 degrees Celsius, right? Like you're not getting geysers of hot air coming out of your storage system. You're just getting slightly warmer air. You can't really generate power from that. You can heat a home with it.
Right.
But in our northern communities, we actually need power generation. I do think that tidal power is something that Canada has some real potential for. And we've been exploring it in Bay of Fundy, and now we have a student here who's looking at it, applications in the north, in the Arctic. There could be some real benefits to that because tidal power essentially is very predictable. It's active all year round, so that could work. Really, that's your palette of renewables to deal with. Well, hydropower would be the other one. Hydropower is fairly well understood and fairly well implemented, to the point that I don't think we're going to see a lot of new dams in the country. So there's a few places where I think we could do more.
Well, and it sounds like each of these renewable sources do have trade-offs when put to scale. So, for example, many people have said for years now that to solve Europe's energy problem and wean them off gas supplied by Russia, just build a huge solar, just cover North Africa with solar panels.
Right.
That would have deleterious effects, obviously, for North Africa. How would you build it? You'd build it completely in the desert. Obviously, hydropower has deleterious effects sometimes if you're flooding whole regions with dams. I don't know if tidal power has effects like that, or we don't know what they would be. But
well, I think the big concern with tidal power is that right now there are potentials to interfere with wildlife. Marine life. There are blades that are turning underwater, and there are whales and dolphins and fish and various other creatures that live in those rivers and live in those streams and live in those bays and inlets. There could be problems, and there have been problems in the past, just as there have been problems with windmills and bird populations and bat populations particularly. So none of these technologies are completely free of problems. I've heard people talk about the building solar arrays through the Sahara in order to power Europe. I think that the problem with that is that we tend to go back to those ideas of scale, that we should be able to build something really big that will power cities, rather than thinking of cities that will power themselves by slowly coating the buildings and the surfaces with solar arrays. What I want to do is a lot harder, actually, and that's where the businessman would say, well, your solution is fine, but it's going to cost a lot more. It will cost more, but over time, I think that the payback is greater because you don't have the infrastructure issues. You don't have the security issues. You're generating power right where you need it. You can probably minimize your storage, rather than maximize it. You're cutting down on the amount of work that's involved in generating the power, which has impacts on employment, and that's something we could talk about. But ultimately, I think that the net benefit is there.
Well, and you're also addressing the moral hazard problem too, I think. If I think to myself, well, I don't have to do anything about climate change because brilliant scientists will come up with ways to produce energy and they're going to save the world. So I don't need to change my paradigm. I don't need to start recycling or using compost or changing the way that I build my home. Just keep things the way that they are. Yeah. What you're talking about is a paradigm shift. It's a much deeper change in the way that we live our daily lives and then the way that we build our cities and our communities.
Yeah, and it is a more expensive way of doing things. Years ago, I was involved in a study. We were looking at home building construction techniques in Japan. And we worked with a company called KST, which was or is a company that's based out of Hokkaido in the north. And they built these basically modular homes. They were about 3 times as expensive as a typical Japanese home. And so the way that the founder of this company got around that is he pitched it as a multi-generational solution. He said, listen, yes, you're going to pay 3 times as much for this house, but you can pay for it over a much longer period of time because you're going to have multiple generations of your family living in this house. It was designed to be very flexible. It was designed to be able to support very young and very old. It was designed to be very low energy, very low impact, very healthy. So there were very few synthetic paints and things like that involved in construction. So you could sort of apply the same idea to the cities of the future. Right now, we kind of try to do things as cheaply as possible in many cases because we don't really want to invest in something when we're not sure if it's going to be there 20 years down the road. A good example is road construction or sidewalk construction. You know, how many times have you seen them pour a road and then 3 weeks later they have to go and cut a big hole into the road because they forgot to do something? And so part of the reason they don't want to invest in the best quality road is because they're going to have to rip it up because they almost always forget something involved.
Right.
So can you turn it on its head and can you say, okay, well, let's design it really well from the beginning. Let's design it to last for 100 years. So we just put it in and it stays. Let's design these houses, you know, to last much longer than I think we really are designing houses for now. Let's put a lot of money and investment into building our urban landscapes because that's where we spend the majority of our time. And let's see if we can find new ways to finance it. You know, we're running into this problem anyway in Canada where house prices have gotten out of reach. Maybe we do need to think about different ways of amortizing the investment and amortizing kind of the costs of doing this work.
Right, and you know, you're talking about future-proofing, really.
Yeah.
And it seems that one of the arguments about public transportation right now is, why are we building trains when we can imagine a future that, say, 50 years from now, vehicles will not be privately owned, but shared, battery-powered electric vehicles that are automated? And so roads essentially become arteries of public transportation anyways, and then railways are rendered obsolete. The problem, I think, with that is again, that's 50 years away. We still need something to solve our problems in the next 50 years. But also, I think it doesn't quite understand the fact that the future is multimodal, that the future is going to be a number of things. There's a mix, a palette, as you say, not only of energy sources, but a way of getting around. There's no silver bullet. And I think the human imagination kind of latches on to these ideas. Like everything's going to be solar powered, done. I don't have to change anything. But the change is going to have to be deeper, more profound, but also multimodal, multidimensional. And I have to think a little bit harder about what that's going to mean.
Yeah, and that's a really good way of sort of imagining it. You know, yes, I do think we're going to get to those self-driving autonomous cars. We are going to be getting to the kind of future where you could just, you know, press a button on your phone and the car shows up and it takes you wherever you need to go and you get out and it goes on and picks up the next person.
Right.
It doesn't mean that we don't need other forms of transport, particularly in bigger urban centers. You know, even a city like Kingston, you know, somewhere down the future, I can see us needing some kind of light rail, you know, running maybe down Princess or something like that. Because what I imagine is that we're going to have smart planning and we're going to develop the city core and we're going to develop kind of that corridor along Princess. And there's going to be enough people that need to move along there that, you know, even with the self-driving vehicles, you're going to have congestion issues if you don't have something else to move people around. Same thing with subways in Toronto. Subways become a really important part of that whole puzzle. Rail corridors, I think, are great. You know, I think that we haven't got that many left in Canada, but the ones that we have, we should be jealously guarding and trying to build up. You know, I'm happy to hear that VIA, you know, is expanding their fleet and, you know, looking at ways of expanding service because I do think that those are the better ways to get around in between cities, and particularly when you're looking at something that would take about an hour or so to fly, you know. You can almost always do better on a train if the flight time is going to be an hour and a half, because by the time you've done security and everything else, you've spent just as much time in the air, and you're going to have a much lower footprint if you go with a rail sort of an option. So developing those solutions now, you know, solutions that work, they're tried and true. I don't think affect the future. What I do think we're going to see in the future is a much better integration between these different modes of transport. Because right now we have a terrible integration. You know, it's hard to move from one to another, largely because if you're driving a car and you want to do something else, you got to find a place to park it, and it's going to be expensive.
Yeah, and you can almost say that we don't quite know what the consequences of these changes will be, but we do know that the changes have to take place. And so it's the responsibility of us as individual citizens, but also of government and of industry, the businesses that will be profiting from this, to not predict the future, but to envision what it could and perhaps should look like.
Yeah. And that's where I think universities play a role. There are students here who have amazing ideas of what the future could look like, and how we might be able to build out. And if you start combining all of these ideas and you're putting them together into the hopper, I think you start to get to some really interesting, exciting futures. And I think that, as you were saying, I think that there's going to be room for a lot of different solutions. A lot of people sort of have this idea that it's going to be one thing. We're all going to move into condos and very tall towers, and the cityscapes are going to start to look like downtown Toronto. Well, downtown Toronto is only one part of Toronto, and the rest of it looks very different. I think people are going to gravitate to different types of living at different points in their lives. I think we should be building urban landscapes that reflect that. I think that the city should be basically powering themselves as time goes on. And I think we're starting to see that. We're not far down that road, but we are starting to see that sort of potential.
So you have a really interesting story of how you became a renewable energy expert and geographer. And so how did that come to be? So because you started in forestry, is that right?
Yeah. So I've always been interested in the environment. I've always been interested in coming up with solutions, proactive solutions. I started in forestry because, first off, it seemed like a really applied sort of a degree, something that was going to give me solutions right away.
Yeah.
And a forester in many ways is kind of like an applied geographer. We learn a lot of geography. We learn a lot of biology. We learn a lot about industry at the same time. But we learn about it in the context of a certain industry or a certain sector. And so I came out of that degree right at a downturn in the industry. So I sort of reinvented myself a couple of times. I became involved in pulp and paper. Pulp and paper also, was reinventing itself. A big part of the pulp and paper industry is actually energy generation. And so I started to get interested in that part of the puzzle. There was a lot of untapped potential there that I think that, particularly at the time in the early 90s, nobody really had a handle on. So I started to get into that space. And then I discovered this whole world of renewables that was out there. And, I was lucky in my career that I happened to start just as a lot of these policies were coming out. It was just after the big UN convention on climate change. It was just after or just before Kyoto, and the Kyoto Protocol and everything that came out of that. So a lot of things were just sort of happening as I was launching my career, and I was lucky to be able to ride that as it came forward.
One of the most fascinating lessons I think that can be drawn from forestry and forests is the fact of the jack pine, which only reproduces, as far as, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, I'm clearly not an expert, but a jack pine only reproduces in the case of a forest fire.
That's right.
Because the seed will only open at a certain temperature, which is only going to ever happen in a fire. Yep. So that means that forest fires are not just natural parts of our planet, but they're natural parts of the ecosystem.
Yep.
And that, I think that maybe there's a lesson there, not just in terms of forests, but in terms of the ecosystem and renewable energies and how we fit in to this mix.
That's right. Yeah, and boreal forests, where the jack pine lives, is a fire-driven ecosystem. Fire is important for renewal. We are at a point in history where we have a problem with too much CO2 in the atmosphere, and big forest fires are big contributors to that. So a lot of us are thinking about, well, can we kind of interrupt the natural cycle and mimic it? So cut down some of the forest, take that wood, use it for something useful, a place where carbon is sequestered for a long period. Build it into a house or build it into some furniture or put it into different products. Mimic the way that disturbance would roll across the landscape. So go out and do tree planting and do the things that are necessary to regenerate that forest once you've actually taken a lot of the useful wood away. Try to get as close as you can to what nature would do, but avoid some of those deleterious effects. And this really should be looked at as kind of a short or a midterm solution. Ultimately, the best way to live in balance with nature is to find a way to let nature take its course, because nature always wants to take its course. But right now, facing the kind of crisis that we're facing, and this issue of CO2 and carbon that we've loaded into the atmosphere that doesn't have a return pathway, I think that there's some really interesting things that we can do as stewards of the landscape to try to cut down on some of those emissions and yet make good use of the material itself.
It's really interesting what you just said, and I think an analog to that would be artificial intelligence over the last little while. When people were first trying to build AIs, whether it was with Watson, the computer that learned to play Jeopardy, or the computer that beat the humans at chess, that they first started out trying to build a computer like any other computer, with code and data and hardware. But what they've realized recently, that the best way to build an artificial intelligence is to mimic the human brain and to create a neural network. And what you're saying is that the best way for us to coexist with nature is to do what nature already does, rather than impose our will upon it. And I think an example of that is something that you know a lot about, which is Fort McMurray and the fire that happened there back in, I believe it's 2016, May of 2016. And one thing that you said about it was that the town was very poorly planned. Because all of the little communities were surrounded by forest.
That's right.
And it was just waiting to go off. But what's interesting about that is that in Fort McMurray, people probably felt like they were living with nature. They probably felt like it was as if they were living in a forest. But it's not just about what we perceive. It's about the underlying effects behind things, I guess.
That's right. Yeah, and the Fort McMurray fire, Fort McMurray is actually a very attractive town when you're in it. I've been there a couple times. I've toured the oil sands, and I've spent time in the town and enjoyed the hospitality. It's a great place to be, actually. The way that it was designed to bring nature into the town, so the communities, or the subdivisions, I guess you could say, were kind of separated by little tongues of forest that ran into the town, which unfortunately were pathways for the fire to travel, and did lead, I think, to some of the destruction that we saw a couple of years ago. We've seen the same thing in other places. In the interior of BC, we had fires last year that were very bad. 10 years before that, or maybe 12 years before, we had the big fires at Kelowna that came down the side of the mountain, burned up $1 million homes that were built, again, to be in nature, surrounded by nature. Nature is very unpredictable. Nature has lots of tricks up its sleeve, I think, and finding ways to kind of roll with those punches. You've got to expect that there's going to be disturbances. There's going to be years that we have floods and years that we have droughts. There's going to be years that there's fire. There's going to be years that there are insect outbreaks, things like that. That's all part of being, within this living system. It's finding ways to adapt to that and really to, safeguard our people, but at the same time allow some of these processes to happen, that I think is important. I'd like to see every urban center not just generate its own power, but kind of mimic the landscape that was there before it, to some extent. And that means using your parks and your protected areas. That means building corridors for wildlife and building viewscapes. It means investing in your urban forest, and allowing streetscapes that include trees and provide that kind of shade. All of those things we know how to do, and in some places we've done really well, and in other places not so well. There's always room for improvement.
Do you think that, say, 50 years from now, if we fast forward, we'll look back at this time, at the renewable energy transition, seeing that it actually occurs the way that we hope it does? Do you think that we'll look back and say, we're not only glad that happened because we avoided catastrophe, if that happens, but we're also glad that this transition happened because we live better, because that our lives are more fulsome, and that we have a better, I guess, interaction with nature and with energy and the environment?
Well, certainly I think that if we can kind of steer this revolution the direction we want it to go, and we can get the kind of technologies and the implementation that we want to see, we could end up with urban centers that are vibrant and do all the different things that I've talked about, we could end up with more protected areas and more wild areas around the cities. One of the problems that we have now is sprawl, and the fact that our cities sprawl, our energy generation sprawls, our industrial activities sprawl. With more and more people, I think it's actually important that we kind of cluster it and bring it back into the urban cores and protect more of those spaces, because people are going to be looking for it. We're always looking to connect to nature and to connect to what's going on. And I think that we're at that point of awakening. We're kind of realizing that green belts are important. Even Doug Ford stepped away from the idea of developing the green belt as soon as he heard the pushback on that. Even though he's probably right that would reduce house prices to some extent. I think people recognize that actually we've got big urban centers. We can fit more people into them, and we can do a lot of creative things with them. And renewable power will help us get there.
So we talked a few minutes ago about, say, having a transportation network of cars that are automated, electric, and shared. I've thought before that perhaps might lead to a different outcome than we expect. Because all of a sudden, if I can grab one of these vehicles cheaply, easily, and can sit in it for an hour on my way to work, it might actually encourage sprawl, because I don't really need to, commute to work and worry about traffic. So I might as well live an hour away in the middle of nowhere. Yep. So I guess that question should lead into my last question, which is, what are the challenges that face this future that we see could be good, that might actually make it something entirely different? And how do we overcome those?
So your example is a really good one. Sometimes these technologies will facilitate things that may not be ideal. And in fact, we see a lot of that right now. We see farmlands essentially being overtaken with solar farms or with wind farms. We are seeing sitescapes or landscapes that are very much being impacted by these new technologies in a way that a lot of people don't like. And that's the genesis of some of the pushback. I do think that the answer to that is to concentrate it into our built environment, because I think that people understand that the built environment is going to look a certain way, and we can actually integrate a lot of what we need to do into that look and feel. So there is a solution there. It just costs a bit more, but it ultimately will deliver something that more people will be comfortable with. The issue of sprawl and the idea that if I could just hop into a car and sit and do work or whatever, I'll live wherever I need to, that is going to be an issue. I think that there's actually a physical constraint to how big a city can really be. Unless those electric vehicles can travel much faster than the types of vehicles that we're using now. If we're talking about 200 kilometers an hour instead of 100, that might change things up a bit. But ultimately, there is a limit, to how far people are going to be willing to travel during a day. There comes a point where finding ways to add density to the landscape, and ultimately figuring out what our targets are. These cities can't grow forever. Is Kingston going to be a city of 150,000? Is it going to be a city of 1 million? What's the vision? I don't think anybody really has thought this all the way through just yet. Is Toronto going to be 3 or 4 million? Is it going to be 10 million, 20 million? If we know what we're aiming at, I think we can build better.
Right.
Yeah.
This has been a terrific conversation. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Thank you. That's our show. Thanks for listening to What on Earth is Going On. Remember that all episodes are available as a podcast, and they can be accessed through any podcast app or found on the website, wogoshow.com. Find the show on social media. I would love to hear from you. Your quote of the week is from the prodigious American inventor Thomas Edison, not long before he died in 1931. Just a few of Edison's inventions include the light bulb, the first sound recorder or phonograph, and the motion picture. Now, in conversation with two other household names, automobile mogul Henry Ford and tire maker Harvey Firestone, Edison said this: "I'd put my money on the sun and solar energy. What a source of power. I hope we don't have to wait until oil and coal run out before we tackle that." Close quote. That was 1931. Thanks for listening.